Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In this week's episode, Erik Davis discusses his new book, Blotter, a deep dive into the history, art and design of LSD blotter paper.
The phrase vanity blotter may not be the clearest term, and it was developed, like so much of the lore around Blotter that informs my book, by Mark McLeod, who is the biggest collector of street blotter and kind of the godfather of the scene. And he used it to name blotter, so perforated pieces of cardstock that have print on them that look like they're designed to carry LSD, that when people start making these objects without the intent of dipping them in LSD, but instead of trading them or selling them as art artifacts, that's vanity blotter. So basically, blotter is a drug delivery device. It only exists in order to provide LSD to people. It's designed to disappear, to be consumed. Nobody kept it around except a few crazy people like Mark McLeod. And then at some point people go, hey, this is actually kind of a cool object. It's like a skateboard deck or a poster or something that it's like another kind of media that we can enjoy and create images on. So the quality of the imagery has changed drastically as named artists start to go, well, I'll make a blotter, why not? This will be fun. And then there's a small but devoted market associated with it. So that's the main distinction between the two kinds of blotter, street blotter and vanity blotter. It starts happening in the late 1990s, and then it really kicks into gear after Mark McLeod's second trial. So he was busted for making blotter, street blotter, but when he was busted, he had thousands and thousands of pieces that he had produced, but they didn't have any LSD on them. They were not dipped. They were not yet dipped. But then there's a problem with the trial, which is why would somebody have tens of thousands of pieces of paraphernalia, of drug paraphernalia, that's only good for spreading LSD? So the defense took the point of view that it was art. It's just another art form. And because there had already been a small trade of people who were collecting these things, whether or not they had acid on them, and some people starting to make them without the intent of dipping them, but just to have them as surfaces to sign or to sell, there was enough of an argument that he got acquitted, because they couldn't show that he was a dealer. They just showed that he was a weird artist who made this weird art that he would sell, sort of, to some degree. And once that happened, then everyone was like, oh, now we have an excuse. Now we can make and sell openly paraphernalia, but it's art as long as it's not dipped. So that kind of kick-started a whole movement that it also went along very well with that phase of the internet, which was a wonderful time to buy and sell. One way of looking at, now I'm going to talk about street blotter, is as a folk art, because you have people who are not thinking of themselves as artists, who are creating images, oftentimes appropriating images, but often creating them as well, and doing so kind of for reasons that we don't really have a name for. It's not for recognition, it's not a brand exactly, is it a badge of identity, is it just a goof, there's many different reasons. So it has that kind of unfocused quality of folk art, meaning that the intentionality is not as clear as it is with commercial art or professional gallery art, where it's very clear that they have very serious intentions about what's going to happen with this stuff. part of that is of course leaning on cartoons, because there's there's a really intimate connection between Blotter, both street blotter and vanity blotter, and cartoons and cartooning. In a way, there's kind of an invitation to escape some kind of sense of adult rationality through LSD, and one way of kind of announcing that intention in an accessible, playful, goofy, sometimes quite ironic way is by using cartoons. I also think there's some kind of dimensions of psychedelic visuals that have a very cartoon quality. You can be in a mode of experience where everything gets kind of cartoony, or all the people turn into cartoons, and there's sort of a cartoon dimension of our own visionary imaginations that I think is also going on there. But a lot of it, I think, is just is playfulness. So there's a lot of cartoons and there's a lot of animals. That was the most interesting category that I discovered that I didn't expect when I went through, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pieces, most of which aren't in the book, or some of which we only have Xeroxes of or mentions in some drug enforcement agency's collection of or discussion of Blotter on the street. But we have, so you can start to put together like, oh, there are tons and tons of things on animals. And I think it's actually not, it's related to that childhood thing. It's like the animals are, we love them, we're attracted to them, they're alien, they're not human, they're not civilized in the way that we are. There's a kind of childlike exuberance around the animal, even weird bugs and creatures and stuff that are kind of not even like the nicest mammals. And that too was a really significant percentage of the Blotter imagery. And it's kind of like a folk art because it's anonymous. We don't know who most of these people are. We never will know. All we know is that it has sort of patterns that we can identify in a collective way, which tend to be more powerful than any particular instance. Often they're kind of naive or not that well executed. Some of them are quite artful, but it's more like a collective kind of process. One of the things that excited me about Blotter in general was the question of materiality, because drug experiences are largely incorporeal. They're in our phenomenology, not in the physical world, even though the physical world seems to change. And then LSD itself is so powerful at such a tiny, almost homeopathic level that LSD itself, or an active dose of LSD, is also on the edge of the incorporeal. And the whole rhetoric of mysticism, of the sense that the whole physical world can kind of melt into a vibrating wave of oneness, is also a kind of sign of a higher, an overtone of materiality. And yet, here we have these grubby pieces of paper with ink on them that are making images. And so there's this almost like inherent irony to the form, which is often reproduced in the form, a lot of which are kind of funny and goofy. I think partly for that reason. There's almost like, yeah, it's still a commodity. It's still a little material object that we need to produce and trade and buy and consume in order to produce this other kind of magical thing. So then what happens when it gets disaggregated from the drug, and then it becomes this weird thing, like this art object? It's not really art, I don't know what you call it, collectible, street art. It's kind of like street art in a way. But one of the things I love about it is that it's still paraphernalia, like literally, because think about it in terms of the LSD underground. So back in the 80s, you wanted to put out your LSD on Blotter, so you made your LSD, and then you got Blotter, you got a Blotter maker to do it, you did it yourself. That was why the Blotter was there, and then there's the acid, and there we go. But in current era, I want to put LSD on Blotter. Am I going to make the Blotter? Why would I make the Blotter? I can just buy art Blotter and dip art Blotter. And some art Blotter is not really appropriate for that because there's too much ink on it. But some of the better pieces, the pieces that connoisseurs recognize are good Blotter, they're good because you can still dip them. And so the art object that has been defanged, that is now no longer illicit, is still potentially illicit. It's still paraphernalia. And that stain carries, it carries with the form. So there's a way in which it will not become completely assimilated. As one of the blotter dealers that I talked to who started dealing with this stuff 25 years ago, so he knows it really well, he was like, Disney is never going to do a blotter edition. They might do a skateboard deck, but they're not going to do a blotter edition. It's just too grubby. And so the fact that a material item can have that implication that's a printed object, like a poster, but just by the fact of the perforation, by the fact of the cardstock, by the fact of the history of the form, it's sort of inherently, almost ontologically illicit, and it carries that. And that's part of the way that the whole blotter market works, because it's not a very coherent market. It's not like Haight Street poster arts, which are a very coherent market, and there's dealers and curators, and they have a sense of how the value works. And it's like blotter is just too weird, and people make a lot of it's really crappy and really cliched and junky and janky, but that's actually in a way kind of part of it. It's sort of like almost like bubblegum cards or something like that, and it has that sort of greasy kid stuff domain, but it's also criminal. So for me, it's just like a delightfully arcane kind of peripheral kind of object that nonetheless packs this sort of symbolic punch.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.